I'm Marie DeNoia Aronsohn, here with New Jersey's first gentleman, John Whitman, husband of former Governor Christy Todd Whitman. We are speaking with Mr. Whitman today as part of an ongoing series of conversations we are having about Governor Christy Todd Whitman's administration for the Center on the American Governor at Rutgers University's Eagleton Institute of Politics. So first of all, tell us about you. Where did you grow up? Where did you go to school? What did you expect to do after college?
Well, I grew up in Manhattan Island, and I'm one of the few people who's a tried and true Manhattanite. And I went to school there until I was in the 8th grade, and then I went to a boarding school in New Hampshire. And after that, I went to Yale University, and then spent 3 years in the Army, one year in South Vietnam, and then came back and went to Harvard Business School. And so that's really what I did for the first part of my life.
What did you think you would do once you graduated college?
Well, once I graduated from college, I knew what I was going to do, which was to go in the Army. But I think
graduate.
When I finished graduate school, first of all, I was a little bit older than most people by that time I was 26 or 27 years old, and I knew that I wanted to have a career in finance.
Backtracking a little bit, did you say you enlisted?
Yes. Oh yeah. Well, as did half of my class from Yale. 1966. I graduated in 1966. That there was no anti-war movement at all in 1966, and you could get out of the service by getting married or going to graduate school, and about half my class from Yale actually signed up, and most of us ended up in Vietnam.
Tell me, if you would, just briefly, if you can, tell me briefly about that experience. Well,
the Army's, I was in the Army, but any service or for a 21 or 22-year-old person, as long as you choose to become an officer, I believe you can have a really great experience. You can have much more authority and responsibility than you probably ever will have again in your lifetime, which is very good training, obviously, for future things to come. For instance, I was the adjutant of a battalion in the Mekong Delta, and the battalion commander, who was a lieutenant colonel, I was the first lieutenant by that time. The battalion commander had general court-martial authority, which meant that he could convene any kind of a trial he wanted to for anybody in that area. And there were 40,000 Vietnamese and about 1,500 GIs. And I was the adjutant of the battalion, which meant that I had to put into effect anything the battalion commander wanted to do. And we basically had a 24-hour-a-day responsibility for all of those people. It's pretty, it's not normal for somebody who's 23 or 24 years old to have that kind of responsibility.
Sounds like a profound experience.
Well, yeah, and I think the military experience is great for everybody as long as you survive it. There are moments when you wonder why you're there or what you're doing or all the rest of it, but then you understand that like a lot of things, it's a job.
Tell us a little bit about your family and its political history.
Well, my father had been born in the governor's mansion in Albany, New York, in 1915, when his father was the governor of New York, and his father was a two-term, but terms then were only 2 years, two-term governor of New York, back in the days before there were even things like budgets. I mean, you read some of the history about this is 1914 to 1918. He was actually the governor of New York during the First World War, and Blackjack Pershing, who was the head of the U.S. Expeditionary Force, was actually the commander of the New York National Guard. And so my grandfather, my father's father, was in effect his commanding officer until the United States government took over and sent him to France. And they moved the capital from Albany to New York City during World War I because of all the things that were going on. It was the main point of going to the main departure point for going to Europe for all the troops. But in any case, this had a profound effect on my father. His mother died when he was 9 years old, and his father, after being governor, started his own law firm, which had his name until long after he died, until almost 2000. And he was sort of the eminence grise in New York City. And so my father grew up that way and actually became a judge. He was an elected judge in the city of New York for 30 years. And he loved doing that job, and that's what he did.
So for you, public service was part of your earliest education, I imagine.
Well, except that I'm not sure I really thought about it that way. There's a big dividing line between people who graduated in college before 1967 and people who graduated after 1967, because all the rules changed in the period of about 18 months. In fact, the time that I was in the Army was when all the rules changed. Because when I came back and went back to Harvard Business School, every rule that had ever existed had gone out the window. But when I was at Yale, they were all still there. Yale was still an old college. Still had, you still had to keep your feet on the floor if you had a girl in your room, and all sorts of, crazy stuff. The stuff that people don't even think about now. But it was very old-fashioned.
So much social change is when you say the rules
absolutely.
changed.
Well, it was a watershed time, very similar to what happened, in fact, during my grandfather's time, 1915, 1917. If you think about it, you had the civil rights movement, women's temperance, women's suffrage. All of the labor union movement, all of this stuff, all happened in 1915 and 1916 and 1917. And very, very clearly we had women's liberation and, again, the second wave of the civil rights, well, you could call it second wave, I guess people would call it something different, but another wave of the civil rights movement and a basic loosening of all the rules. Some people would say that we sort of threw out everything that we held worthwhile, and some people would say that it was time for a change. So that's where we were.
How did you first meet Christy Todd?
I met her at a party when she was 18 and I was 20. But we really, nothing came of it. There wasn't a setup or anything like that. She was at the party, I was at the party, so that's how we met.
Where was the party?
It was actually out where she lives in New Jersey, and the party that was given by her grandmother, and I was just sort of one of the normal invite. They would, if you recall Casablanca, they said we'll run up the usual suspects. Well, I was one of the usual suspects, effectively for this, and so we met then. But over the course of the next 10 years, we kept meeting various times and places, and either getting along or not. Mostly not. And so on. So, but unlike most relationships that teenagers and then young 20s have, I sort of give it a nautical view. If you think about it, you meet somebody and your ships cross, and for a while maybe you go along together, but then you steam off in different directions. Well, since we kept running into each other all along here 3 or 4 or 5 distinct times, I figured that our ships were going like this, which meant that they were going in generally the same direction, which was very unusual because if you remember your 20s, most ships didn't ever turn around. they just kept going.
Were you in the same social circle? Was it politics? What brought you together?
Well, the summer that I was of my first year at Harvard Business School, Christy was at the Office of in 1968. Christy was in the Office of Economic Opportunity run by Donald Aronsohn, co-worker. It was our previous vice president, Dick Cheney, and Christy. And I was at the Department of Transportation for the summer, working, and we were both in Washington, and we'd known each other before, and so we decided to play tennis. Absolutely hated each other, because she was going to change the world through the Office of Economic Opportunity, and I worked at the Department of Transportation, and I thought, well, we can figure out how to fund the Highway Trust Fund. This isn't really a very big problem. I mean, this is the one of the great things about being young. You don't know that you don't know anything, and neither of us did. But that was one of the times that we ran into each other, and then. Soon thereafter, in 1972, Christy needed a date for for Richard Nixon's second inaugural ball, and I think she'd just broken up with one or another of her boyfriends, and she called up and said, "Come on down. There's a good party going on. We'll have a good time." So I went down, and that was kind of the beginning of the end.
Do you have a very clear recollection of the first time you ever saw her?
No. Well, I know when it was and where it was, but there wasn't music playing. The strings weren't out, and this wasn't sort of the love of my life has wandered into it.
I'm getting that picture, but you really came. The beginning of your romantic relationship, you would say, happened at Nixon's inaugural ball.
I think that's probably the safest definition of it, yeah.
Describe for us your role in her earliest campaigns.
Well, basically, I stayed home with the kids because we went to, after business school, I went to work for Citicorp. And Citicorp in 1976 asked me to go to London to start a business for them, and obviously I was going to take my wife along, but she wasn't allowed to work or anything along those lines in London, and so after we got a dog, she then decided it was time to start a family, so that's what we did, and our daughter was born in London, but very soon thereafter. Christy said, well, look, we've either got to decide that we're going to be expats, which means expatriates for a good long time, because living wasn't exactly bad in London, or we got to go back, and I'd like to go back because I want to start my political career. And so we came back in 1978, and very soon thereafter she started her local political career and became a freeholder in Somerset County, and then the freeholder director. And in the meantime, our son had been born as well, so we had two little kids, and we were living in New Jersey, and I was still working for Citicorp, but back in the United States.
So you knew with this partner that she was going to pursue politics.
Oh, for sure. Yeah. Basically, I would say that our marriage vows would really be in sickness and health and in politics.
There you go. Her Senate campaign.
Yes.
What are some of your, what role did you play? I know you said you were taking care of the kids. Was this campaign a little bit different than her local ones, though, for you?
Well, she was such a dark horse, and we had so little money. And again, interesting enough, even through her gubernatorial campaigns, they were all ancient history type campaigns compared to what's going on today. You still wrote people letters. You still hand signed them, stamped and folded up things and put them in envelopes and sent them off to people. It was very much like my experience between Yale and Harvard Business School. That campaign was, you wouldn't even recognize it. You'd think it was in the 19th century compared to the way the campaigns run today. And the only reason that we could run it at all was because there was a certain amount of matching funds, I believe, even then. There certainly were for the gubernatorial elections. But I think even in the Senate, if you wanted to take it, you could. Bradley, of course, didn't because he had all the money in the world. But I think we ran the whole campaign against him with less than $1 million of support. And the usual things that you have to get used to happen, like this U.S. Senatorial Campaign Committee promised her that they'd support her, and then at the last minute they said, oh, gee, some guy who actually lost by at least 30 points is coming up. We got to go support him, so we're going to take the money away from this person with no chance in New Jersey. And of course, the pundits, as usual, were wrong. And, with a few more bucks, she might have won. But she would have been miserable if she'd won. One of the things that she'll tell you, and very clearly, is that she's not cut out to be in the legislative branch. She believes that you should construct a policy. If it's a good policy, put it in, and if it's not, don't. But don't put half of it in. And the legislative, even though at the current time it's a little hard to see people believing that the legislators are there to compromise, basically that's the job that they're supposed to be doing. And if you're an executive type person, you're not going to be very comfortable in the Senate, or certainly not in the House of Representatives.
So that would be one of her strengths, knowing what
and eventually she made a hesitating start of running for the Senate after she was governor, but very quickly decided that she really didn't have her heart and soul in doing it, and didn't want to do it, and didn't want the job as she'd wanted.
Now that Senate campaign,
which Senate?
Her first Senate campaign against Bill Bradley. Yes, I'm sorry. That was I would imagine, quite a turning point for her career because of how surprisingly close she came to beating Bill Bradley.
Oh, absolutely. But it still didn't make her the shoo-in for the gubernatorial nomination. And we had a real catfight with Carrie Edwards over that for the next well, that was 1990, and the election was 1993. So for governor, but you had the all through 1992 the primary stuff.
How was that for you, and what role did you play during that period?
Well, I'm always on the sidelines. I don't believe that you should ever be in competition with your spouse, and I don't think that, for instance, I don't think two lawyers should marry each other. It's just not a good idea, and it's certainly not a good idea to have two politicians marrying to each other. And so, as far as I'm concerned, I would go off to the office and to my office at Citicorp and try and make a living for us, and then come home and listen to whatever was happening to happen at the time. But obviously, it's a high high octane kind of occupation when you're actually running a campaign for something, or a primary. And it's hard not to get swept up in what's going on. And clearly I had an opinion, not a very educated one from the point of view of a political side of things, but I would certainly have an opinion on what should or shouldn't be being done, or whether this ad or that ad was a good one to have or not. But most of my comments, I tried to keep all of them, but not all, didn't succeed. Most of my comments would be just between me and Christie.
How did you feel about Jim Florio?
Jim Florio?
Post-campaign, after going through everything. Or how do you feel about him today?
Well, he got, in my mind, what happened to him. He sowed the seeds of his own demise. He was a capable, pugnacious person, but he wasn't warm, and he didn't appeal. He's even today. I actually like him a lot, but nobody would describe him as being a warm personality. I mean, it's not like Brendan Byrne, or Tom Kane, who are like two big teddy bears. I mean, kind of thing. Jim always had an edge on him. He had it. I think he's had it for all of his life. And he got to a point, I think, where he started to believe his own propaganda. And when you start to believe your own propaganda, when you can't tell the difference between propaganda and truth or reality, that's when you lose the ability to actually carry on. And I think that happened to him. And I think he drank too much capital Kool-Aid from Mr. Carvel and a few of those people who said, well, we can paint Christy Whitman as the rich bitch from the hills, and she'll never win in a blue state. Well, they made I think the classic era of underestimating their enemy.
Is there any ad or specific moment in the campaign that you can think of as an example where you felt very strongly about which way it should go?
Well, I always felt strongly about which way it should go, but
I don't mean the outcome. I mean in terms of yes, I think you did. Yes, in terms of perhaps there was a particular ad under consideration that you felt strongly about.
Well, again, there's kind of a blur, and it's difficult to keep one campaign sorted out from another. So I'd just sit in the meetings, and then I'd tell Chrissy what I thought, but usually not in public.
I understand.
Yes.
She took a lot of criticism, and there were a lot of attack ads about the farm tax subsidy. What was that like for you to see that all sort of unfold? Did you anticipate some of the hits?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And I think that one of the more famous things that there were two events that we had as far as the farm is concerned. This is really once the campaign was going. This is once we were fighting with Florio. We had these huge signs made up that covered the roof of our house and covered the roof of the barn. That said, we paid, and I think it was something like, at the time, $19,050, or there were $19,500 of real estate taxes on this place, because the clear implication always was that we had the farmland assessment, we didn't pay any taxes. Well, the farmland assessment only works on the land; it doesn't work on your house, and so we decided that since we thought that somebody might just cruise overhead with a helicopter and take a few pictures, that we would try and mess up their life. Now, think about this. Nowadays, you have with Photoshop, you could have just taken it right out. But then this is a real deterrent. Then we actually still have those banners. We use them to cover the hay after we harvest it in the summer.
That's funny and kind of ironic too, I think. Describe your role.
Let me tell you, there was another event that I actually loved. It was a great one, and I think it was dreamed up by my brother-in-law, Danny Todd, who is from time to time Christie's campaign manager and sometimes not. But he said we're going to have Farm Day. And it was again responding to this issue that it wasn't really a farm or anything along those lines, and so we had all these. We said we'll have Farm Day, and all the newspapers sent their people with cameras and all the rest of it and we sat everybody down and fed them all. It was like like the hamburgers and hot dogs and things like that. And about halfway through lunch, I think it was Danny, it may have been Christy, I don't think it was Christy, I think it was Danny, got up and said, well, we want you to understand that everything you've been eating, we produced here. This is, and then there was this gal from, I think from CBS, who came in a Chanel suit with velvet shoes. And she said, she asked for this. I would have done it, but other people would not have. She said, well, can I see some of the animals? She said, all right, come on. So we walked her through every cow pat in the place. to get her to go look at the cows, and say, and she went up to the cow with her microphone and said, "Say moo." But it was so great. There's a pink, I'll never forget it, pink Chanel suit with black fringe and black velvet shoes, walking through the barnyard. Come to the farm for lunch. Yeah. That's classic,
I have to admit. What was your role in her administration?
Oh, I didn't have any role in the administration. In fact, as late as even into her second term, there were occasionally things in the newspaper said, well, we're waiting for John Whitman to show up and tell everybody, sort out what's going on or something. I mean, there's a basic disbelief that a woman could do the job, and therefore, it was absolutely necessary for me to stay as far away from Trenton as I possibly can. I never went to Trenton, never. I do effectively one project a year from a charitable point of view, and that would be it. But if I started showing up in Trenton, the legislature and all the rest of it would have been starting to ask questions. Well, how much, John Whitman wasn't elected in anything, so what's he doing here, and what's he talking to you about, things like that. Just was not on. So it just never went. And
you feel that was because she's a woman?
Oh, absolutely. Because, people don't ask guys who makes their suits and things like that, or spend their time saying that the governor wore this, that, or the other thing.
Yeah.
Crazy.
When it came to your area, obviously, of expertise, your areas of expertise, then if you were to advise her, which I imagine you did, but you tell
Sure.
me, that was all behind the scenes. That was something just...
Yeah. Well, and normally she would ask and say, well, what do you think about this if it had to do with finance, something along those lines, which a lot of things do in the state government.
Absolutely. Do you think in that way would you define your role as having been rather substantial behind the scenes?
Not really, because she would ask me what I thought of what other people had said to her about things. She didn't say, well, what policy should we have? She'd say, well, we're thinking about this, or we're thinking about that. And my role would be more to say, well, look, if you're thinking about that, have you also thought about where that leads, or the ramifications of what you're doing, or what the next step would be, and how the financial community is going to respond to that particular problem.
Did you disagree strongly with the way she handled any policy in particular, any of her, say, political issues or hiring decisions?
If I disagreed, the fact remains that she has much better political sense than I ever would have. And so the only place where I think I might have disagreed with any strength would be in some financial matter. But it wouldn't be on that. Her biggest problem actually was that she had better political sense than any of her advisors, and she got into trouble when she followed their advice against her own judgment. Because there were many times where she would get up and say to me, "Look, Joe Blow says I should do it this way. And I just don't think that's right. I think that it would be better to do it this way or that way and all the rest of it. My response would always be, well, you should do it the way you want to do it. But on a number of occasions, she went with the advice of the people that, after all worked for her. The times that she got into trouble were when she allowed either did things or allowed things to go along that she didn't really agree with.
Was that frustrating for you to watch happen more than once?
The governor of New Jersey has so many irons in the fire at so many times that you don't want to get frustrated about everything that goes on. I mean, the place I got totally frustrated about was the pension bond deal, because the treasurer couldn't seem to figure out how to explain it to anybody. And here you had a liability that existed already that even the Republican people said, this wasn't a liability, you made it a liability. Well, this is crazy. I mean, this was an unfunded pension liability that was going to have to be funded in the next year or so, and they bumbled around. Couldn't really had a hard time convincing even the Republicans that this was a problem that had to be dealt with, and that this was the best way to deal with it. And it should have been. It just was badly handled by the Treasury. It should have been dead easy. I mean, we've got a $3 billion potential liability. We're going to have to fund it next year or the year after anyway. If we fund it now and put the money in the stock market, it will cost us a hell of a lot less than if we wait around and try and fund it later. And that should have been it.
And that was your advice.
Well, it's not a question of what my advice was. I mean, my advice was the treasurer sure as hell ought to be able to communicate this to these people and not have it go on for months and months and months. For absolutely no, as far as I could tell, no reason. With both sides going completely like this. I mean, I don't. Half the people said I don't understand this, and well, they probably did. And they, in all frankness, they probably did. But it wasn't that difficult concept to understand. You had to understand that you had a liability. Yes, it wasn't on the books, but it was going to be on the books. And this was a mechanism for funding that liability.
There you go. Subsequently, she was trashed by this issue more than any other. Did you suggest that she respond, and in what way would you? If so, how?
Well, I think pretty much just the way I responded to you. It said that this is a simple problem, people, but you have to start out by saying, you have to start out by convincing them that you actually have the liability. The first step, because most of the legislators, I don't know what they believe this liability was, but they didn't believe it was a liability of the state. They just. There was no groundwork done to say, look, this liability exists. It's not on the books today. It's going to come on the books next year or the year after, and we have to deal with it. And we can deal with it now, or we can deal with it later. And the treasurer was never able to bring himself. I think this was Brian Clymer, I believe. And he in the legislature, he didn't believe he thought the legislators were all a bunch of jerks, and he treated them that way, and so they refused to actually listen to him about this whole issue, and it just resulted in this ridiculous conversation that went on for forever.
Right. If they weren't communicating it, if they weren't either understanding it or communicating, then the press must have. Well, I know what the press did with it.
Yeah.
So,
absolutely.
Yeah.
So but I keep coming back to the fact that it's a relatively simple concept that everybody made much more complicated for their own reasons. The Treasury made it more complicated because they wanted to look smart. The legislators made it more complicated because they wanted to look stupid. And a whole bunch of people wanted to just be able to sort of deny that it ever happened. I mean, it was completely crazy. I mean, here's a real. It's like saying we're on the Titanic and that's an iceberg, but we're not going to recognize that it's there. I mean, it's nuts.
Frustrating, I would say, for you. You mentioned touched on gender discrimination a few minutes ago, but at the kickoff event at Eagleton last May, you accused the panelists from Governor Whitman's administration of being too polite about gender discrimination. You spoke about gender bias against her and her administration continuing even today. Discuss that.
Oh, okay. Well, you see, I think women have gotten shell-shocked because they don't want to bring up the fact that there's gender bias, because if you do, then it sounds like you're whining, and so and it's not likely that too many of the guys are going to bring up gender bias because, one, they don't know it personally, except it through somebody else, and second of all, it's not they're the beneficiaries of it. So few people are willing to get up and say what really needs to be said because it's not politically correct to do it. And it just never bothered me at all. It was clear to me that every step of the way that a woman had to be better at whatever job she was doing in order to, if she were going to compete with the guys for the same job. Just it's proven every time I see it in business and everything else. The women who rise to the top are head and shoulders better than the guys that they beat.
The consequences of not speaking up
are what we have today. So the women get paid 73% of what men do for the same job. Yeah. And even worse, we have all these angry old white men who think they should control what women do with their bodies, which is completely beyond me.
As far as you can discuss from your perspective as first man, how different is that from the way first ladies are treated?
Oh, remember, first ladies are supposed to look sicky sweet, sit in the back row, and sing well with the choir. That just was never going to be a role that I was going to play, but I didn't have to because I wasn't really a first lady.
It sounded as if anything, there was a lot of pressure for you to step up and, as we discussed earlier, and play more of a front role.
I don't think so, because I think we all recognize that a couple things. First of all, I hadn't been elected anything. And second of all, because of gender bias, people would give me much more credit than I was due if I actually showed up. So the two things together meant that it was just much better not to show up. And I did have a few other little things to do on the side.
Did you accompany your wife to the National Governors Association or other out-of-state trips
Sure.
like those? And what was your role when you were there? How did that play?
Well, the National Governors Association, actually the major role of it is when you have a new group of governors to get the new governors and their spouses together with the old governors and their spouses to try and help them get used to what is going to happen. And so a bunch of us were always talking to new governor, in my case, and most of the spouses were women, obviously, but the rules were pretty much the same. It was I had a very simple little thing that I would say to all of the new spouses, governors' wives. or husbands, which said, you have to understand that you weren't elected anything. You have to understand that the public doesn't expect anything from you. But you have to also understand that you have two tremendous powers that nobody else in your state has. And those are, if you call somebody else, they have to return. You have to take your call or return it. And if you call a meeting, they have to come. And I would go on and say, as long as you don't overplay your hand, this can be one of the great powers of all time for doing good in your state.
I was going to say, there's so much power in that.
Well, think about it. I mean, and that's what what we did. I could go on for hours about that, but that was basically the blurb to new governor spouses.
How did you use that power?
Well, as I said earlier, I would do usually one eleemosynary activity for the state a year. I mean, the greatest one was the thing called the Dimes for the Dome, which was wonderful. And I'm trying to think of what other ones we did. We had breast cancer awareness one year, which was the project that all the governors' wives nationally took on. It was the Governors Association's wives group took that one on. So we did. And I'm trying to think of what other. Well, we had a drum whacket project. We wanted to make sure that the school children, as part of the 4th grade class, got to go to drum whacket as part of the New Jersey history part. So I would do one project a year, and that would amount to calling up a few appropriate people and asking them nicely to contribute their time and their money, and then we would, do the whole project. But it was meant, they were all bipartisan, certainly, and they were, clearly non-political things to do.
One of them, the Vietnam Veterans Memorial.
Well, yeah, but I guess that counts. But that of course, since I am a Vietnam veteran myself, that one was, that counts. I guess as a project that I did but I did it as much because I was a Vietnam veteran as I did because I was the First Lady of New Jersey.
First Lady.
In drag.
But it must have been a gratifying experience that you were able to use that very particular power that you outlined to move that project forward.
Yeah, well, but the interesting thing there was, I had some great support from a fellow named Larry Cody, who ran PSE&G, who was also a Vietnam veteran. And he got the whole of PSE&G behind the project, and this is the kind of thing that would happen. But what he came to me and said, which is what I all of us were stunned by. He said he hadn't realized how many of his employees were Vietnam veterans until they did this, because nobody came forward and nobody had ever come forward and talked about it. And they all came up to him and thanked him for doing it. And he said it was just amazing to him how many Vietnam veterans there were who, for various reasons, and we can go through what they were, had never sort of identified either with themselves as Vietnam veterans or with anybody else.
I've been to the Vietnam Veterans Memorial several times to cover stories, and it's a very powerful place to me. How do you feel when you're there?
I think the most interesting factor of it to me is the diorama of the time frame, because again, here is a time of vast change going on, and all of us who were in the service were kind of stuck in a time warp while all of that stuff happened, and we really weren't here. And when it came back, you had to deal with the results of all of what had happened. And that's, I think, partially the reason that so many people who were Vietnam veterans never talked about it, never relays the stories. They're not like World War II veterans, or even now Iraq and Afghanistan veterans. It was a particularly difficult time, I think, for a number of people, and it was especially difficult, I think, also for the people who were in college at the time, who had started college with all the old rules and had them all changed in the middle. And with women's liberation on top of it, I think there are a lot of women who got caught sort of between heaven and hell here, between the old and the new, and how are you supposed to act and what's supposed to happen. I think, to me, it was extraordinarily exciting to come back from the Army and then go to Harvard Business School and be subject to all of this. I mean, to the extent that it's kind of a conceit, but it's really true, that I would tell you that I got radicalized by Harvard Business School. It doesn't sound like the thing that would, whatever. Well, but my class at Harvard Business School is the only class at Harvard Business School that ever went on strike, didn't finish its freshman year, and because the class was made up of, guess what? Half the people who graduated from college in 1968 who'd done nothing but riot the whole time, and the other half were Vietnam veterans. There were a few other groups thrown in that sweetened the pot a little bit, but basically this was a complete the complete antithesis of each other, and then Kent State happened in the middle of it, and the whole place blew up. But 40% of the faculty turned over between my first year and my second year at Harvard Business School.
Wow.
Because they hadn't quite gotten, they were a little late to the party. the old school hadn't quite left yet. That was the end of it, at the summer of 1968.
What an experience.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it was great fun. If you're a single guy, come back from fighting in the jungle and go to Harvard Business School and find out that there's a jungle there too. It's just slightly different.
Going back again, and in your role, your negotiating powers when it came to the Devils.
Well, first of all, I had no negotiating powers. My wife said to me, "Well, it would be nice if you could keep the Devils here, but we don't have anything we can give them." And besides which, you don't have any statutory grounds. All you are is a guy hanging around who happens to be married to somebody who might have some statutory powers. It was interesting because for a long time we didn't really make any progress because the Devils were doing other things at the time, and actually were negotiating with Nashville, and had really come to an agreement with Nashville. Ultimately, the reason that no matter what I did or anybody else did, the reason that the Devils stayed in New Jersey is because John McMullen, who owned them, wanted them to stay in New Jersey. And had he not wanted them to stay in New Jersey, they would not have been in New Jersey. So
you feel you didn't have an influence on that?
Oh, we had some influence on it, but what I think it would be a wrong statement was to say I did a lot to keep the Devils in New Jersey. What I think I did was, with a whole bunch of other people, is negotiate a bunch of details after the decision had been made.
How did it feel to be part of that?
Well, I mean, to have a major discussion where everybody else is getting paid and you're not. What was this? Being an investment banker, I mean, I'm always used to getting my piece of the action, which didn't happen. No, it was especially given what happened with the team thereafter and so on, and the friendship that John McMullen had with my wife. All of this was terrific, but that's why it all happened.
What were the biggest surprises for you being married to the governor of New Jersey?
The biggest surprises?
Yes.
Well, I think the first one is how pervasive the thought that a woman could never do the job right really was. I mean, it's always just completely floored me. That's one. Surprises. I guess the other thing that became obvious very quickly was how much of a national figure Christie could become, how quickly. And again, this goes back to because the quality of the other people just was not anywhere near her ability to communicate through the television and just the fact that she's basically a common sense person in a world that's sort of crazy, and it never occurred to me that the other people would not be as gifted basically as she is, and it became very obvious to me very quickly that the people we elect are not the best people in the world to have running the place.
That's quite a surprise to come upon. How did it feel for you when she was criticized, mocked, even attacked in the media?
Well, a lot of that happened, but there were, most of the time it was the other way around. Things went the other way. I mean, nobody gets a free ride all the time, the biggest battles that she really had and continue to have always been with our own party's conservative element, always, because she is such a threat to them. You're not threatened, and you don't go out of your way to go after people that you're not scared of. And the right wing of the party is desperately scared, always is desperately scared of Christie, because she could communicate with everybody and make good sense. And she wasn't going to be just outright partisan about everything all the time. And back in the times when she was running, the Republican Party was much more moderate than it is today. And even then, the right wing of the party just hated her. They would, and today certainly, they would do anything in their power to defeat her, even if it meant losing. She's kind of the Antichrist to them. And and the reason that they're scared about it is because she's electable.
That's what I was going to interject, and she's popular, so that combination.
Yeah, it's their worst dream, which is that because until this recent election, the conservatives have always been saying we didn't get elected because we weren't conservative enough. This is the first time that they really can't get away with that. But in previous elections, they've said it all the time. Said, well, if this guy or that guy hadn't been so weak on this conservative issue, we would have won this, or something along those lines. Even though they were kidding themselves, there was enough evidence for them to at least continue to kid themselves. This time, there's so that's better.
What did you think when the buzz began about vice presidential buzz began?
Well, I think it all happened very, very quickly. If you start to think about remember, she was elected in '93. She took over in '94. The presidential election was '96, the first one with whatever his name. I have this. I don't know. I can't remember anybody's name, but the Senator Viagra.
So dull.
And she wasn't anywhere near ready for that, and knew it. Just the way Chris Christie, pretty much the same way. Had it been a year or two later, if the cycle had worked differently, I think things could have been quite different on that scale. But the other thing is that the governor of New Jersey is the most powerful governor of all 50 states by the state constitution, and you're not really sure you want to give up being the governor of New Jersey to if you want to do something for being the vice president of the United States. Now, if you get asked, it's pretty hard to say no, but you can do a lot of things to make sure you don't get asked.
Are you saying that she took those steps?
I'm not saying anything. I'm just saying that it is possible to make sure that you don't get asked.
Okay. About your family life during the governor years, mm-hmm. the years in the State House, how did it change? How did relating with your children change during that period?
We actually were quite lucky that the time frame turned out the right way. Taylor, our son, who's our younger child, went off to boarding school in the fall of 1993, which meant he and his older sister, who was already at boarding school, were both out of New Jersey effectively for the entire time she was governor. That did leave us with having to deal with teenagers with all their problems during vacations. But the idea and this is another thing that conversations with the spouses of the new governors, which is you have to make a pact with your children, especially if they're teenagers. And the pact goes something like this, which is you can have tremendous advantages being the children of the governor. You can pretty much, you can go to any rock concert you want. You can do pretty much anything you want to do. But if you get into trouble, the whole thing is going to be amplified so far that you are going to be miserable. And as long as your children are rational and understand that conversation, and it's not an easy conversation to have with a 15-year-old, who believes that they never did anything wrong and that they know everything. As long as you can make that conversation, it can work great. But we spent a lot of time making sure that our children spent as much time out of the state of New Jersey as possible, and that's really I'm not sure how you organize a household with young children who are going to school every day and do this as well. It would be very difficult to do that. We lived half the time, depending on where what the schedule said, we would either stay at Drumthwacket or at our farm. They're an hour apart from each other. And my office here is in Princeton, so staying at Drumthwacket wasn't a problem for me. But we could be pretty casual about where we were going to be. If you have a family with children who need to get fed 3 times a day and go to school, it doesn't work as well, for sure.
So having them out of New Jersey was to protect them, in a sense?
Well, it protected everybody. It was just a great idea. Well, but the other thing is that the governor has of I think any state, but certainly of New Jersey, has so much to do that he or she doesn't have the time that you should spend with your children if they're there. You know, that you're going to get caught between heaven and hell all the way along. I mean, I don't know how the current governor and his wife deal. They have 4 children or 5? But they have a lot, and they're younger. And they're younger, yeah. And I think they're all pretty much all at home going to school. I mean, that's got to be frantic.
Yeah. What if anything would you do differently if she ran today, or do you wish you had done differently then, as you think about it?
Heavens. Since I really didn't do very much, it's a little hard to answer that question. I'm not trying to be evasive, but it seems to me that my job was to go off to my office and provide an element of stability to what is inherently an unstable, crazy world, and it. I mean, I hate to. I can't, in all honesty, say I wouldn't do anything differently, but I'm not exactly sure what it would be that I would do differently. I might not yell at the press as much, but I didn't really. I tried not to do that often. Just when one or two of them got to the point where it was impossible not to yell back at them.
I can appreciate that for sure. What are you most proud of as Christy Todd Whitman's husband?
Oh, of her. I mean, as I've said, I believe she was a better politician and a better policymaker than virtually anybody we ran into. The only better retail, well, that's not true. Bill Clinton's basically the greatest retail politician I've ever seen in my life, and I believe probably the greatest in history. But the list gets mighty short after that, and she's on it.
Nicely said. What advice would you give the next male gubernatorial spouse?
Oh, it's pretty simple. Dennis Thatcher said it for us all, which is, you weren't elected anything. When the press asks you what your comment is, say you don't have any. When the press says the public has a right to know, tell them they don't. And never give an interview.